Okay, hello my awesome students. Tonight you are going to learn all about the food chain and the vocabulary that we need to know that goes along with it. Now I know this is something that most of you are very familiar with, but we need to make sure that we do understand each part of our food chain. First thing we need to start with is the ultimate source of energy, which you guys know is the sun. Okay, so the ultimate source of energy for all living organisms, and remember an organism is a plant or an animal, is the sun. That's where the source of energy is going to start. That's where our entire food chain always starts. Whether or not it's pictured or not, it always begins with the sun. And without the sun, think about it, no ecosystem in the whole world could survive. Okay, so the first important piece of vocabulary that you need to know, and make sure you're writing this under the correct tab in your journal, is the producers. Okay, the producers are the organisms in our food chain that make their own food during photosynthesis. Well, you guys just learned about photosynthesis. Who are those organisms that make their own food? Right, plants. Okay, so our plants are our producers. Okay, think about it. Plant starts with a P, producers start with a P, photosynthesis starts with a P. So if you think of all those P words, then you'll know that we're talking about plants who make their own food through photosynthesis, and those are called our producers. Okay, those are those ones, they need the direct energy from the sun. Okay, so when we talk about a producer, we're going to talk about how they get their energy from the sun, and we're going to do this for a producer because that's like our tree. Okay, so producers make their own food during photosynthesis. The next important part of a food chain are our consumers. Okay, so the consumers are the part of the food chain, the part of the ecosystem that has to physically eat another organism in order to get their energy. Notice I said organism. Okay, and remember an organism is both a plant or an animal. So some consumers are going to eat producers, which are plants. Other organisms are going to eat other consumers, which are other animals. Okay, so, sorry about that. So make sure you understand that a consumer can eat either a plant or an animal. So we can put it in other terms in fancy science vocabulary. Consumers can eat other consumers, or consumers can eat producers. Or sometimes some consumers can eat both a producer or a consumer. It just depends on their diet. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so make sure you know that consumers must eat another organism in order to get their energy. The next big part of our food chain that we often forget about but are super important are our decomposers. And decomposers, they basically break down dead plants and animals for energy. And a lot of people forget that decomposers are living things. They are considered biotic factors in our ecosystem. And they're so important because they're going to put back nutrients into the soil. And you know that that's an important part. I'm so sorry, I don't know why this keeps popping up today. That's such an important part of our food chain, because who do the decomposers directly help? If they're breaking down materials and returning it all to the soil, well, what's going to grow in the soil? Those plants, those producers. So it's so important for the whole food chain to exist in an ecosystem for those decomposers to be present and to break down the dead plants and animals, put the nutrients back into the soil so that those producers can grow, and then the consumers can then eat the producers and everybody's happy. So those are our decomposers. Alright, now remember when we talked about consumers, we talked about how some consumers eat producers, which are plants. Some consumers eat other consumers. So we've got 3 types of consumers. How many consumers do we have? 3. Okay, I'm going to ask you that tomorrow. I'm going to ask you how many consumers do we have, and you're going to say 3. Okay, so we have herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. All of those are considered what? Consumers. Okay, they're all part of our food chain. They're all consumers. Okay, so the first type of consumer is an herbivore. Those are consumers that eat only plants. Okay, and you can see there's a nice little picture with some examples. Okay, they eat leaves, grass, flowers, seeds, roots, fruit, bark, pollen, and so many other things. And just some examples are like deer, horses, rabbits, grasshoppers, anything that's going to eat a plant. Okay, so in our food chain, we're going to have the sun first. The sun's going to give energy to the producers. Then the producer is going to give energy to the herbivore, okay, because they're going to eat the producer, so they're going to be first in line. They're going to be the first consumer, which we call that a primary consumer. A primary consumer is always going to be an herbivore because it's going to be eating the producers, okay? The next consumer is an omnivore, and an omnivore is a consumer that eats both plants and animals, okay? So their diet consists of producers and consumers. So you've got to make sure that you know that some, like us, we're humans, we eat both plants and animals. And then there's some more examples right there. Most bears, raccoons, the snail in our aqua farm, that is an omnivore. Okay, so omnivores eat both plants and animals. And then we have our carnivores. You guys are pretty familiar with these carnivores. They're consumers that eat only animals. Okay, so that could be an insect, it could be, you know, a bird, a shark, a snake, a mouse, anything like that. So it eats, you guys know carne. Carne means meat. Okay, so meat comes from animals, so carnivores are the consumer that eats only animals. Okay, so those are our three types of consumers: herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Okay, all of them are part of our food chain in some way. Okay, and when we put all of that vocabulary together, here's an example of a food chain. So we have our sun, which is giving energy to the producer, and you can see that producer also needs that carbon dioxide and water in order to produce its own food through photosynthesis. Okay, and it gets its own energy. So it starts with the sun, producer is able to live, then you have, you'll notice, a line of consumers. And in a food chain, what do you also notice? What are those red things? We've got arrows. And the important thing about the arrows is that it shows the flow of energy. So tomorrow I'm going to ask you, what does the arrow show? And you need to tell me the flow of energy. The biggest misconception is that people think that the arrow shows the direction of who's eating who, but that's not true. Okay, the producer is not eating the primary consumer. The producer is giving his energy to the primary consumer. The primary consumer is giving his energy to the next consumer. Okay, so the arrows show the flow of energy. Okay, now you'll notice those fancy words of the primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer. That's just basically the line of who's eating who. So, you know, you have your producer, and then the first consumer in your food chain is called the primary consumer. Then there's another consumer that's going to eat that consumer, right? That second consumer is what we call the secondary consumer. And then there's going to be another consumer that's eventually going to eat that consumer, and we call that a tertiary consumer. We can actually go on and call the next one a quaternary consumer, but you don't need to be too familiar with that. But do know that, you know, a secondary consumer is going to eat a primary consumer, a tertiary consumer is going to eat a secondary consumer, because there's always more than one consumer in our line of a food chain. And then you'll notice this food chain, and not all food chains show it, is the decomposers. And notice where the arrows are going for the decomposers. It's going from the tertiary consumer back to the producer. And basically what that's showing is that eventually that tertiary consumer, it's going to die in some way. And when it dies, those decomposers are going to be able to break it down and put those nutrients back in the soil. And then who's that directly going to go to? Help, the producer. And then that producer is going to be able to go through that whole process again and be a part of the ecosystem. So those are food chains. So make sure you know what the role of the sun is, what the producers are, the consumers are, the decomposers. Make sure you know how many consumers there are and what the difference is between each one. And also make sure you know what the arrows show. And be ready to talk about it tomorrow and learn a little bit more about our food chains. Have a fantastic night, and I will see you tomorrow.